come from the Gospel of Mark. We're at the beginning. And if you've forgotten the very beginning of Mark, I encourage you to get it out or look it up online and read the first 14 verses again. If it's something you don't remember, it's Jesus coming and being baptized and going off into the wilderness. So if you can share the screen, Andrew. All right. Here's the word of God from the Gospel of Mark. After John was arrested, Jesus came into Galilee, announcing God's good news, saying, "Now is the time. Here comes God's kingdom. Change your hearts and lives and trust this good news." As Jesus passed along the Galilee Sea, he saw two brothers, Simon and Andrew, throwing fishing nets into the sea, for they were fishermen. "Come, follow me," he said, "and I'll show you how to fish for people." Right away, they left their nets and followed him. After going on a little further, he saw James and John, Zebedee's sons, in their boat, repairing the fishing nets. At the very moment he called them, they followed him, leaving their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired workers. Very short reading from the Word of God. Immediately, they followed him. Have you ever wondered what actually happened along the Sea of Galilee? Jesus come to the shore fresh from the desert. Remember, he's been baptized by John, as I said. The heavens ripped open and connection of heaven and earth exposed, laid bare. And then in typical Markan form, in short order, Jesus is in the desert. He's there for 40 days amongst the wild beasts. And he's waited upon by angels. It's Jesus, fresh from this 40-day experience in the wilderness, that he comes to see Simon and Andrew throwing their nets into the sea. They were standing on the shore, throwing their nets out and pulling them in, throwing their nets out and pulling them in day after day, time after time, doing what they could to keep body and soul together. Jesus says, "Come, follow me." Did they hear him announce what it was said in verse 14? Now is the time. Here is the good news. Here comes God's kingdom. Or was it just something about Jesus that was so charismatic? I so wonder, right? Is it just like he was just like so amazing right off the bat that they just followed him and left everything? They left their home, their families, and followed. And then when he went along a little further, he finds James and John. Now, James and John were in their boat, which should give you a little clue, right? They were fishermen as well. And I'll tell you, I often think of them all the same. 4 guys, 4 fishermen. They all meet Jesus on the same day. They all follow Jesus. But Andrew and Simon were throwing their nets from the shore. They couldn't afford a boat, most likely. James and John, however, were with their father in a boat. So they were fishermen, yes, but socioeconomically, perhaps a little bit better off. They not only left their nets and their father, but they left their hired hands. I hope this story is familiar to you. I hope it continues to intrigue you. What does it take to follow and leave everything behind? They left everything, absolutely everything, and stepped into uncertainty with Jesus at a very uncertain time. The time in which Mark was first heard was uncertain. It was written in approximately the year 70, a time of great unrest in the land that we know as Israel. For years, there had been a festering amongst the Jews under Roman occupation. There had been little skirmishes and insurrections, if you will, here and there, trying to overthrow the power of Rome. They succeeded every now and then for short periods of time. But Rome, imagine it, a Roman legion and a bunch of Jewish folks wanting not to be under their control. It doesn't take you too much to know in history that the chances of the Jewish revolt were pretty slim at the start. And sure enough, by the end of the year 70 AD, the temple lay in ruins and would stay that way for centuries. And the Jews and Christians amongst them would have been expelled from Jerusalem. So the story was first heard in times of uncertainty, but it was written about times of uncertainty, right? It was written about the time of Jesus, 40 years earlier, a time where there was Israel found itself being pushed and pulled between the Romans who wanted to garner favor with Caesar or gain their own political power. Lots of stuff happening in that land, and Rome wanted to control it. They needed to control it for the wealth that they could get out of it, extract from it. They also needed it for trade routes. So the interesting thing is, like in other situations, the further you got from where the main power was, and Rome had its main power in this region in Jerusalem. There were, ancillary offices, but the main power was in Jerusalem. And the further you got away from Jerusalem, particularly the further north you got, the less likely you were to want to kowtow to those folks in Jerusalem. And Galilee is to the north. So the land that Jesus lived in, grew up in, around Nazareth and the Sea of Galilee, where these 4 first disciples come from, was a hotbed for rebellious ideas, especially amongst the poor and the marginalized. There were constant challenges to Rome's authority. Now, Rome was interested in maintaining what they called the Pax Romana. And I always heard of this in school. I always hear about it. I heard about it when I was growing up in school, that this time period was so peaceful when Rome ruled the world. Well, it was peaceful if you look at the fact that there weren't any major wars. And that was because Rome made sure they kept everyone under their thumb. Well, more like really under their foot. They liked to keep things peaceful. These times in which Jesus lived were fraught with uncertainty. And so the text was written in uncertain times, about uncertain times, and it's being read today in uncertain times. There's no doubt that our own time is uncertain, right? We have a global pandemic going on. It doesn't care what the political boundaries are. It doesn't care what's a state or what's a nation. It doesn't care any of that. It doesn't care about ideologies. If you're a Packers fan or a Buccaneers fan, it doesn't matter. The virus looks for one thing, and that's a host. We have no idea when it will end. We have no idea how many will die. We have no idea what the long-term ramifications of the loss of life and the shifts of economy that come about as the result of death and changes in our work and consumption are going to be. And then there's just the plain old uncertainty of life. If you've realized lately that all the stuff that you normally have to deal with, it didn't go away just because we have a pandemic. It didn't go away just because we've had other kinds of uncertainty. The normal uncertainty in our life exists in the midst of it all. But this uncertainty isn't something we normally think about, at least I hadn't, with the call of the disciples. We often think about their faithful response, like, would you have gone along? Would you have followed? Would you have left? And we know that the disciples in Mark, at least, well, the way I call them is the disciples. They don't quite get what's going on, but they followed nevertheless. And we think when we think about the disciples, we think about the things they saw and experienced with Jesus when they went along with him. The healings, the challenges for justice, the welcoming of an outcast. Don't hinder the child to come to me, the comfort for a widow and those who are grieving. They saw the confrontations with authority and knew there was little chance of that going well. They were there, and they were empowered to continue all that Jesus did, empowered to work on the behalf of the poor and marginalized, to feed the hungry, to comfort the afflicted, to seek and work for justice. That's what we normally think about, and that's good. It's right, it's true. And those are the things we try and do, right? That's why we made a meal for the guest house. It's an opportunity for us to think about justice. It's an opportunity to feed the hungry. But this morning, the thing I want to think about is the following part, not the doing part. I think we've got the doing part down. Always room for improvement, always more opportunities. But I think we've got that part down. How about the following part? And what I mean by that is if I'm walking with someone down the road, for example, if they're behind me, I'm not following them. If they're right next to me, I'm not following them. Only when they're in front of me am I actually following them, when I can see them walk in front of me. What does it mean to consider following in that way? The way of invitation of Jesus to follow me, saying Jesus to us in few words, that I will go before you. I'll be there ahead of you every day, all the time. Years ago, I read a book, which I have right here, called Prayer, Stress, and Our Inner Wounds by the Reverend Flora Slossner-Woolner. And it's a book that truly changed my life because it allowed me to think and understand that way of following a little differently. It allowed Jesus to go ahead of me into any uncertain times. And what I've decided to do is, instead of trying to paraphrase, I'm going to share a lot of her words. And so they're her words, and I think that they're helpful for us to think about how we follow Jesus. She's a retreat leader, and so people tell her about things, and she leads retreats, obviously, by the name of the book, on prayer, stress, and our inner wounds, on inner and personal healing. But one of the times she said, a woman came to her at retreat and said, my painful memories about my childhood are being touched and healed. They had done quite a bit of work already and have prayers to guide that process. But next week, she said, my sister is coming for a visit, and I'm already worrying about it. I'm afraid we'll get upset and angry with each other again, and then we'll repeat the old patterns and make new wounds. I think we can all think of similar anxieties. I'm going to the doctor tomorrow, and I'm worried what she'll say. I have a job interview coming up. I have to make a speech or a presentation tomorrow. Maybe it's not a specific fear, but maybe a general worry, like, if I'm a parent, will I be adequate? In my health, how will it be? Am I going to be seriously ill? Certainly something people consider these days. I have wonders and concerns, perhaps some anxiety about old age and helplessness. How do I know I'll be wise and courageous when trouble really hits? I might go to pieces. These are the kinds of worries, and you have them of your own, I'm sure, that fall into some of these categories and beyond. But she writes that it comes as surprising joy to many to realize that the power of God's healing love encompasses not only our past, but our future. If we're following Jesus, we're looking forward into a future. What we call the future is no barrier to God's love, she writes. She said one day she began to worry about a large class that she was scheduled to teach. She writes, I had thought, though I had taught many classes through the years, for some reason I was worried about this one. I felt inadequate and somewhat intimidated. On the first day of class, I was sitting in my office, trying to relax in soaking prayer, visualizing the light of God's love surrounding me. Then the thought came to me, how would it be if I visualized the healing light filling the classroom itself right now before the class meets? How would it be if I asked Christ to go ahead of me into the room, touching and welcoming all who entered, including me? I made this prayer clear and specific, she writes, and I had asked the risen Christ to walk into that room where I would soon be, and to fill it with his light and warmth and strength, to bless and heal the experience to come. Of course, I knew that God's love was already in that room, even before I prayed about it. God's love is always everywhere. But by this form of symbolism and imagery and prayer, I was able to enter more fully and intensely into that experience of love and claim its reality in my life. That relaxed, healed strength seemed to wash over me like a wave when I entered the classroom half an hour later. I felt comfortable and enabled. As the students came in, there was a feeling of warm friendliness amongst us. I felt it as if we, teacher and student alike, were held in the same light and the same embrace. Naturally, as in every challenging situation, there were problems to face and to be worked through. There was a lot of hard work to be done. The presence of Christ does not release us from problem solving and hard work. The Lord is not there to remove the real challenge, but to enable us to meet them with serene power. I could visualize anew the risen Christ entering the room, taking charge of all that was in, blessing and fulfilling the events to come. To me, that's what it is to follow Jesus, to allow Christ to go before us in every situation in our life, those that especially are uncertain. And I will tell you that when I visit your homes or call you on the phone or come to the hospital or lead a funeral or anything like that in my capacity as pastor, I always pray as this woman taught me, envisioning Christ before me in that room, surrounding it with love, in your home, surrounding you in love, in schools and in hospitals, in grocery stores, envisioning God's love enfolding you. And I will tell you that that has made a world of difference to me. A world of difference to me to follow Christ that way. And again, it doesn't negate the hard work that has to be done in those situations. It doesn't negate the grief that we share together, the loss of a loved one or a diagnosis or prognosis that is one we don't want. It doesn't change the hard work of ending a relationship or starting a new one. But if we imagine that following Jesus is both the doing, but also the following, that we allow Christ to go before us, how does that change what it means to be a disciple of Jesus Christ? I want to invite you for just a minute to think of an experience that's coming up in your week. Doesn't have to be an anxious one, just something that's going to happen in your week. Maybe it's Takeout Tuesday. Maybe it's a new part of your job. Maybe it's a finally get to go back to school, or maybe it's a Zoom call that you've had 50,000 of them this week and you just don't need another one on the schedule. Maybe it's a customer calling again, going, when are you going to service my thing? All those things. Maybe it's just being alone again, home again. I would like you to hold that thing. I'm going to give you a minute to gather that. And now I would like you to envision following Christ into that space or time or place. What would it mean to have Christ in that room, in the office, in the school, in the store, ahead of you? Filling the space and time and place with light, the light of 1,000 stars and the one that shone over Bethlehem. What would it be like to enter that space or place or time when it was truly filled with the warmth of the embrace of God? I imagine it will feel a little different. I imagine it will be just a little easier. And I imagine that this kind of praying and following, allowing Christ to go before us, is one of the things that perhaps when we think about discipleship, we neglect. We think about the doing. Let us remember that Christ is also being a disciple, not only doing the discipleship things, but following, being willing to step to the edge of uncertainty and letting Christ go before us. And when Christ is there, filling the space with light and love, filling that relationship with light and love, imagine that Christ turns to you from that space and smiles and says those simple words, "Follow me." It's the light of the 2 candles on the altar, Christ's divine and human capacity, the light of the Christ candle that shines, the light of God's love that enfolds you always. Enfolds you always. May we not only do the work of discipleship, may we allow Christ to go before us so that we might truly follow. Amen.